Welcome everyone to the Starting Point Education channel. My name is Loretta Depka and I'm lucky enough to be here again with Pat Obst, an LCSW who specializes in grief and loss. Tonight we're doing a 4-part series that Pat will join us each week through June, and we're going to talk about the loss of loved ones, starting this week with grandparent, parent, and sibling. Next week, we'll be talking about spouse and significant others. So I'm glad you're joining us. So let's get started, Pat. I feel like everyone knows you at this point, but Pat is a therapist here at the Starting Point. Family is core, and Pat, you have talked about this. Family is core to our sense of self, of belonging and support. When we lose someone from our family, many things can shift, such as our roles and our responsibilities. We can feel lost and insecure about our place in the world and future. Pat is here today to help us understand all the nuances of the loss of a grandparent, a parent, and a sibling. She will share with us how to navigate these losses so that we can journey through them towards mental and physical wellness. Okay, Pat, let's begin with the loss of a grandparent. Many people think that a loss of grandparent is not that major of a loss because they're older and it's the natural order of things. But what happens when the loss of a grandparent feels more intense or becomes complicated grief?
So let's start with uncomplicated grief. Uncomplicated grief around a grandparent is, my grandmother died at 95 in her sleep. She led a good life. We had a good relationship. Sad, I miss her, but not complicated. The opposite of that is the more complicated grief around a grandparent. And one of the things that can complicate it is if you are particularly close to your grandparent, as if they were a parent, because maybe one of your parents died and that grandparent kind of stepped in, or if you had a dysfunctional family and that grandparent was an emotional, social support, your safe haven, your safe place to go, across the street to grandmom's house when mommy and daddy were fighting, that sort of thing, then the pain can be much more acute. You can feel more anxious or depressed because that sense of safety and security and support is gone. Even though you're a grown person, all of a sudden it taps into when you were little, right? So I had a client who, she was very close to her grandmother, and her grandmother was that safe person in a lot of turmoil in her growing up years. And when that grandparent died, she came to see me because she was so distraught. And so first of all, I had to acknowledge that her loss was not just, the natural order of things, just a grandparent. It was the intensity of that relationship then played out in the intensity of the grief. And so one of the ways that she dealt with it was she created a children's book. She wrote a children's book, beautiful colored illustrations of her relationship with her grandmother when she was little. And so that helped her to tap back into that safe feeling, right? And she was feeling very unsafe. She also, on her own, started a grief podcast called The Grief Bully. And I'm going to make a plug for her right now. It's called The Grief Bully. And she just, as just a layperson, just puts it out there and gives people an opportunity to ask questions and that kind of thing around their grief. So that was a way that she channeled some of that. Another way that it can be intense for people who lose a grandparent is if they feel a lot of guilt over not spending as much time with them. They get busy, they get married, they have children, they've got jobs, life is crazy, they're on a treadmill. And then all of a sudden, grandmama or grandpa pass away. And, I encourage them to remember that their grandparents were their age once too. And, their grandparents had all the same kinds of responsibilities, and maybe their grandparents even felt badly about not visiting their grandparents because of the busyness of their lives and the responsibility. So that's that putting yourself in that common humanity, and having some compassion, self-compassion for that position you were in of having so many responsibilities and not having as much time. And also, one of the ways that we can kind of calm that guilt is to carry on some of the traditions that our grandparents had.
That's a great idea.
Just to honor them. A funny one that I have is my grandfather used to play this dollar game with us, where he would, if you pinch your pointer finger and your thumb together, and then you pull them apart about an inch. So if you had your hand like that, my grandfather would hold a dollar bill above that, and he would say, "Watch the dollar, watch the dollar, watch the dollar," and then he would let go of the dollar, and you'd pinch your fingers, and you'd miss every time. So, as a kid, of course, you're trying to get the dollar, because as a kid, $1 is a lot of money, right? But as you would watch your siblings, you would learn, oh, you have to watch his fingers, not the dollar. Right? So you'd eventually figure it out, and then he would always let you figure it out, and then you would get the dollar. So, I used to, when my kids were little, I used to do that trick with them. Here, look at this trick my grandfather taught me. And, of course, I would do the same. I would give them the dollar in the end. But so those little traditions we can, or bigger traditions, whether it's cooking traditions or whatever it might be. My daughter makes her grandmother's meatballs.
There you go.
And nobody else is allowed to make the meatballs. And she's staying at my house right now for a few weeks, and I was going to make the meatballs. Don't you make the meatballs? She said.
I love it.
Because she makes them exactly like her grandmother made them.
Right.
So, we can carry on some of those traditions as well to help with any of that kind of guilt. So, it's important for us to understand that the relationship that we have with them is what dictates the uniqueness of our grief. And then, what kind of support we need around that. It's not just a throwaway loss, because it's a grandparent, it's a natural order. It's a very significant loss, and we need to pay attention to our particular relationship with them and what it means to us to have lost them.
That makes sense.
And then address those issues and get the support that we need around that. Because they're important. They're an important part of our family.
Absolutely. Okay, Pat. So now let's talk a little bit about the loss of a parent. What are the struggles that most people experience when they lose a parent at a young age?
So at a young age, there can be that feeling of abandonment besides the grief. And sometimes, like, if people don't talk with the child about loss, because they're young, right? And back in the old days, they wanted to just, move on. And that we found was very damaging to young children, because they would really not only feel abandoned by the parent who died, but they'd feel abandoned by everybody else, because they had no idea what's going on. They're confused. They're little. They don't understand it.
Right.
So that's one of the things that we've learned, and that I encourage people that I work with, that I have parents who've lost their adult child to, let's say, a drug overdose, but their adult child has a 5 or 6 year old child. And I really encourage them to talk with their child about the loss of their parent, and help them be a part of the grieving process, have them help them with a memorial garden, have them paint rocks for daddy or mommy that go in the memorial garden, those sorts of things. So, at a young age, in order for them not to feel as confused or as abandoned, it's important to talk with the children about that. Also, if you lose a child at a young age, I have a couple clients who lost their mother when they were about 5. And I talked about the one before in talking with grandparents. She happened to have an aunt who was very much like her mom. And so, not that she took the place of her mother, but she could really fill in a lot of the love and the nurturing and everything. So it wasn't as difficult for her. But I also had a client who really developed a lot of issues as a grown-up around not, having her mother die when she was 5. And so what I did with her was I had her bring in some keepsakes of her mother's, just whatever she had. And we went through item by item. And she talked about those items based on the stories that she had been told, from family members about, oh, this is why your mom had this, because she used to like this, and she had this hobby and that sort of thing. So she talked about those. And she found out that her mom also was a writer and wrote a column for a newspaper. And this client happened to be very good at writing briefs and things. She was a lawyer. Like that was her forte in what she did in her job. And so she saw this article that her mother wrote. And so right there was all of a sudden this connection of my not just knowing that her mom wrote, but reading those articles. So that made her feel more connected. And then when she saw an article about, and a picture, it was a picture of school buses in the background and her mother holding her and other mothers and their children. Her mother had written a whole article about they were going to stop busing in that neighborhood. Okay. And she had written a whole article about how important it is to keep the buses in that neighborhood. And so it gave my client a sense of, wow, my mom really did love me and was looking out for me. And
oh, wow.
So, and then I had someone who lost her mother when she was around 20. And her mother had been an alcoholic. And they had a very, conflicting relationship her whole life. And I had her do the same thing, bring in items from her mom. But hers, some of the things she had were writings from her mother's when she was in rehab for the alcoholism.
Okay.
And her mother writing down her struggle, how much she wanted to get better. And she wanted to be a better mother to her daughter. And just seeing that helped her to really feel like her mother really tried, which then, helped her with her grief and her able to connect with her mother based on her mother's love for her, that she just never felt quite as intensely as when she read those. So, those are ways that you can help somebody who's, lost a parent at a young age. Also, I lost my mother just when I was getting close to her. And I would consider myself fairly young when I lost her. Sorry, it's raining very hard out here. I don't know if you can hear that. I was getting very close to my mother. I was in college. I was 24. We were writing letters back and forth. We would spend time together when I came home from school. And then she died. So it was this, we're getting close. We're starting to be like two grown-ups, like two friends. And then it was cut off. So what I did was I talked a lot more to my older aunt, who really kind of filled me in on my mom as a person, when she was a teen, when she was grown up, when she was a mother, and that helped me to kind of just fill in some of those gaps of, I was just getting to know my mother when she died. So those are some ways that therapists can help people in that position. And at any age, what happens is sometimes this loss of a parent makes us feel orphaned. If you've ever heard anybody say that.
of course, I was one who used it. All of a sudden you realize you're alone. You know that
Right.
at least that parent that, unconditional love, that you always knew you could depend on. It's different.
Right. It's an unsafe, it's a weird feeling. I felt like I didn't exist for about a week. It was the weirdest feeling I've ever had when my mom died. Felt like I didn't exist. And it's also, these people knew us from day one.
Right.
Right. And sometimes siblings can fill in that gap. But that is just one of those losses that, it's something we had that now it's gone. And we just have to allow ourselves to grieve that. But that with that unconditional love, that's also a reason why it's so important for us to develop a self-love. Because not only sometimes do we lose that unconditional love, sometimes we lose a love we never had. Let's face it, there are some parents that we don't feel unconditionally loved by.
Absolutely.
And that's another thing that we have to grieve, what we never had. And so, all the more reason to get the support through support groups or therapy to unpack all that.
What I hear a lot from individuals that are losing parents when they're older, there's also that guilt of saying, what a relief, because you've been caring for them. And I'm sure that's, you care for anybody that has an illness. But with a parent, it just feels really bad when you feel guilt about the relief.
Well, so relief is a very human feeling. And, we have to separate it. We have to be specific about it in that we're not relieved that they died.
Right.
We're relieved that the caregiving, and not only our struggle, but our parents' struggle is over as well. So it's a relief about the struggle. It's not a relief that they're gone. So there's a difference.
For that first period of time, that it's very confused, the relief, right?
Right. Well, and sure, people are going to have that feeling, but we need to come around to that. It really is. It's a perfectly normal. Right. And I have parents who've lost children to drug addiction who, dealt with the addiction for 10, 15 years. And so there's a sense of relief, not only for them that that worry and the struggle is over for them, but also the struggle is over for their child.
Right.
So it's again, you're not relieved that they're gone. You're relieved that the struggle is over. And another thing that can happen with, when you're older and you lose a parent is that a lot of older children have, they have to wrap up all the financial stuff, right? They have to wrap up the loose ends, pack up the house and get the house sold and all that kind of stuff. It can be stressful, but it can also be a distraction from the grief itself. And so what I make sure people understand is that even if you don't wrap up all that stuff for 9 months or a year, don't think that, well, it's too late to grieve now. I'm a year past. I need to just move on. When all those loose ends are tied up, take some time. Take some time and really grieve rather than just moving forward, because it was paused. You're not done grieving. It was paused while you took care of all the loose ends. So go back to it, be with it, feel it, let yourself grieve. And one other thing is our own mortality. If we're the next generation, we lost our parents, right? Guess what? We're next.
That's a whole nother issue of aging, right?
Right. But instead of that freaking us out, we can actually turn it around to say, you know what? This is a good chance for me to reassess my life and say, what's important to me now? How do I want to live out these next 10, 20 years of my life? So it can actually, be something that we can turn around to be a positive thing for us to look at.
They were really helpful things, Pat. I think it's something that we all as we age and lose our parents, we need to remember. So thank you for that positive stuff.
You're welcome.
So let's talk about the loss of a sibling. What are the dynamics of grief that someone experiences when they lose a sibling?
So some of the dynamics, I'm just going to kind of list them and then just talk about kind of how to handle those. Siblings, the articles that I've read suggest that there's this, what they call forgotten mourners, because their grief gets overshadowed by the grief of other family members. Like, think about it, especially their parents, right?
Oh, okay.
Gets overshadowed by the parents or the spouse or, the what would be the grandchildren. I'm sorry, the siblings' children that they lost.
Right.
Everybody's worried about, okay, so let's say it's a female and her brother died. Everybody's worried about the brother's kids, right? Everybody's worried about the brother's parents. Nobody's worried about the sibling.
Right.
So they can be considered the forgotten mourners. There's also, a lot of times siblings have less input to the funeral, the memorial services, the arrangements, because a lot of times that goes more to the parents. Now, certainly if the parents are so distraught, then the opposite can happen where it all falls on the siblings. So you can have one or the other. Also, sentiments and condolences, like at the funeral, people are saying, "Oh, I'm so sorry for the loss of your brother or sister," right? And then they say, "How are your parents doing?"
Oh, that's true, Pat.
Yeah, they go right to, or, "Oh, how are your brother's kids doing?" Right?
Oh.
So there's that forgotten mourner thing again.
Oh, you're right.
Okay. And a sibling can feel abandoned by the parents. Okay. Not that the parents are doing that on purpose, but there's this double loss that happens. So the sibling has lost their brother or sister, and they also, at least for a time, have lost their parents.
Sure.
Because the parents are not the same, right? So those are the different things that are very unique to someone losing a sibling. And I'm not going to go into exactly how to address each of those, but I would just say these reasons are why it's so important to find a support network apart from the parents, right?
Sure.
And because you're so forgotten, don't forget yourself. See, a sibling can take it all on or be cast out in the corner because everybody's looking at the parents. And if you don't get your own support, then you're forgetting yourself too. You see? So it's important for siblings to recognize that their grief is completely legitimate and just as intense, and you deserve compassion and acknowledgement and support too.
And I imagine, you hear the stories of when teenagers lose a sibling, parents would rather it would have been them, all of that stuff that comes up.
Well, that's
the more dangerous it is.
Right. And that's something that I'm going to talk about as far as the responsibilities. But before that, there's a lot going on around the siblings, like what we just talked about, but also within. The sibling has lost a friend, maybe even a protector, right? That other sibling might have been, the older sibling in school who protected them from the bullies in school.
Right.
Or, God forbid, protected them from an abusive parent, right? It's their confidant. How many of us share secrets with our siblings?
Right.
For older siblings, sometimes it feels like the loss of a child, especially if you were significantly older. I have a woman in her 70s who lost her younger brother, who was like 12 years younger, and her grief was so intense. And the more we talked, I said, you know what? I said, you really took a lot of care of your brother when you were younger. I said, you didn't just lose a sibling, you lost a child. And when she just filled out, and she said, yes, exactly. And so I had to treat that not just as a loss of a sibling, I had to also treat it as the loss of a child.
That makes so much sense.
And I had another younger client who lost her brother to suicide. And she had a very abusive, a dysfunctional family. And she protected him a lot. In fact, she protected him from drowning once. And so he died of suicide. And so the intense grief she had was not just that of a sibling. It was, she felt like she lost her child. So that's something very significant that the therapists have to pay attention to. And, there's also the changes in the role of that we pictured with our siblings. As we're getting older, they're going to be our bridesmaid, or they're going to be our best man. They're going to be our child's aunt or uncle. We're going to have our kids together. They're going to grow up as cousins. So those are all the things that, again, go on inside of a grieving sibling that you need to acknowledge and get support for, either professionally or, with friends, cousins, make those bonds with those people so that you feel, a lot of people say, oh, I have this best friend, she's like a sister to me.
Right.
Right. So those bonds are very important. One other thing that siblings can deal with is guilt. Because maybe there was sibling rivalry, there was jealousy, or there were arguments and that sort of thing. To which I say, sibling rivalry is alive and well. Siblings fight until they're 80 years old. That we can't live every moment as if our sibling's going to die, right? We have to just live. And I swear some siblings fight just as entertainment, especially when they're little.
Right.
Right. So we don't need to carry quite that much guilt around, I think.
You talked, when we were talking about this earlier, you talked about the roles and responsibility shift within the family when a sibling dies. Want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, of course, there's a kind of a redefinition of roles within the family. You may take on new responsibilities, right? Let's say there's three siblings and one dies. Two of them lived close to mom and dad, and lived close to mom and dad, and one of them lived far, and one of the siblings really helped to take care of mom and dad. Well, that sibling dies. Well, now the other sibling who lives close by is going to have to pick up that slack. Right? So, all of a sudden there's new responsibilities for either that sibling's children or the parent, your parents.
And I imagine a lot of new tensions too.
Yes. If you're the youngest of two, all of a sudden you become, or if you're like in the middle and the oldest dies, all of a sudden you're the oldest sibling. Right? So then everybody's looking up to you in the family. You become, the older sibling that everybody looks to because the other one has passed. Sometimes you become an only child. Right? There's only two of you. One dies. I have a client whose brother died, and she saw what it did to her parents. She had very complicated health issues and almost died. It had to do with childbirth. And so it made her really ponder whether or not to have any more children, because she didn't want to put herself at risk, because if she died, what it would do to her parents. So what happens is, if you're only one of two, when that other sibling dies, you almost feel like you have to be hyper vigilant about yourself to stay alive. You see what I'm saying?
Sure, they solve the pain.
It's an extra layer of responsibility.
Right.
And you know, so these can often, you know, make you feel more stress or maybe more resentment. So you know, again, I tell people seek out support, but also give yourself time to readjust to some of those new roles. You're not going to slip into them right away. Give yourself, you know, some time to adjust. Also, there's sometimes fear of hereditary factors. If you had a sibling who died of a specific disease, let's say, right? You know, so you can either get checked or not get checked. Let's say it's the BRCA gene, right, for breast cancer. You know, you can get yourself checked or not get checked. I mean, that's a personal thing, but sometimes that becomes a concern for a sibling. You know, I got, and that can happen with a parent too. If a parent died of a specific thing, like I got genetic testing for colon cancer because that's what my mother died of. So if that's a concern when someone dies, again, it's a personal choice. You can get checked for it or not, and that may help ease some of your concerns. Sometimes the sibling feels like they have to fill in for the deceased sibling, to which I say, no one can take the place of a child who has died. Okay, you can't fill in for your parents, for your brother or your sister. You can't. You can fill in as far as like caregiving, like if you have older parents and you have, but emotionally, you're not going to do that. So don't even try. Just be yourself. Just be the person you are to your parents. Don't try to be who your sibling who died was to your parents emotionally. And you know, some worry that their parents would have preferred
Right.
they die. Parents love their children equally. They like them differently because it's just personalities, right? If your child is a lot like you, you might clash more. Where if you have a child who's not like you, easygoing temperament, you know. So we have to be careful to not. Parents don't want any of their kids to die. Okay, they wouldn't rather have one die than another ever. They love you the same. They might like you different or get along differently with you, but they would be just as devastated if you die. Even if you guys fight like cats and dogs all the time, they would be just as devastated if you died as they were with their sibling. They love the same. You have to remember that.
I like that phrase you used. They love their children equally. They may like them differently. That's
right. Yeah. That's the reality of it. So, you know, all these things being said, you know, we grouped these three losses together because it's the family unit. And whether our family is a healthy one or a dysfunctional one, it is an important part of the human experience. And so, you know, we need to take these losses seriously and get the support that we need, not, you know, brush them off, like I said, with the grandparent. It really depends on the relationship that you've had with the people you've lost. You know the kind of support you need, because your grief is unique to you. So, you know, getting the support, because the family unit is such an important part of who we are, our identity, our responsibilities, all of those things that we talked about. And so in order to grieve well around those, we need to pay attention to how we're really feeling and get the support that we need.
Wow, that was really helpful. I know I'm going to have to go talk to my sister now.
Yeah, you better. Hey, my sister's coming up from Florida next week.
I just feel like all of a sudden I need to call her and chat.
Yeah, there you go. Good, good. Okay, everybody who listens to this, go.
Right,
Call your grandparent, or call your parent, or call your sibling.
There you go. That's the message we're giving, right?
Yeah, there you go. There you go. Exactly.
Thanks, Pat. I really appreciate it. And I think this was very helpful.
All right, thank you.
So next week we're doing loss of spouse and significant others. So
Yes.
I'm looking forward to that. But we're going to do it Tuesday instead of Thursday.
Yes, because my sister. I know that's a different thing. That's a graduation I have to go to. That's not my sister coming up yet. All right. Take care.
All right, Pat. Thanks a million.
Bye-bye.
See you next week. Bye.